Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're taking a look at a case that's been making headlines for years, the Monica Cimienti case. A true crime story full of twists and turns, and, well, let's just say it's got all the elements of a Hollywood thriller: love, betrayal, luxury, and a murder that shocked everyone.
Absolutely. And it's a case that's really captured the public's imagination.
Exactly. So we're going to break it all down using court documents and news reports to give you the full picture.
It's a story that begins, you could say, with a picture-perfect life in Los Angeles. Monica and Fabio Cimienti, they had it all right. A beautiful home, a successful business, and a romance that seems straight out of a movie.
Yeah, you can't help but picture the California dream, right? And Fabio's career in the beauty industry is pretty impressive. Started as a hairstylist in Canada and worked his way up to a top executive position at Wella.
He built that success with his sister Morella.
And from everything we've read, Fabio was just as charismatic and fun-loving as he was successful.
Oh, absolutely. Friends describe him as the life of the party, the kind of guy who could light up any room. That's actually what makes the night of January 23rd, 2017 so much more shocking.
Because that's when it all changed.
Yeah, Fabio was found dead by their pool, just slumped over in a chair.
It's a chilling image. And the initial assumption, I mean, it makes sense. They thought it was a knock-knock burglary,
Oh, sure.
right? A crime that, unfortunately, was becoming all too common in their affluent neighborhood.
Sadly, yeah.
You think you're safe in your own home, and then something like this happens. It's terrifying.
And to add to the tragedy, you've got the accounts from Monica's friends, like Elise Bluell, who remembers Monica's complete devastation when she found Fabio. It seemed like pure heartbreak, at least at first glance.
But of course, that's where things take a turn, right? Because as detectives delved deeper into the case, they started to uncover inconsistencies in Monica's story and in the details surrounding Fabio's death.
You start to see these cracks in the facade, these little details that just don't quite add up.
And one of the biggest bombshells to drop was the revelation that Monica was having an affair with a man named Robert Baker.
Right, an affair.
Suddenly, this seemingly random act of violence starts to look like it might be something more premeditated, more calculated.
That's exactly what the prosecution is alleging. They believe that Monica, driven by her passion for Baker, and maybe, just maybe, by greed, conspired with him to murder Fabio.
Wow, so they're saying she might have been the mastermind behind it all? But how do they prove that? Especially when there's no direct evidence linking her to the crime itself. No smoking gun, so to speak?
Well, that's where things get really tricky. The prosecution is building their case on what we call circumstantial evidence. They're trying to piece together a timeline, placing Baker at the scene and connecting Monica's actions to his. For instance, they'll probably scrutinize every communication between Monica and Baker, looking for anything that suggests they were planning or plotting something. They might even try to demonstrate that Monica provided Baker with information about Fabio's daily routine, the layout of their house, anything that could have helped him carry out the crime.
So basically, they're trying to paint a picture of Monica as a co-conspirator, even if she wasn't the one who physically committed the murder.
Exactly.
That seems like a tough case to make.
It definitely is. Proving a conspiracy based largely on circumstantial evidence. That's a challenge for any prosecutor. They have to convince the jury that all these individual pieces of information, when put together, create a clear and compelling story of guilt.
And what about Monica's side of things? I mean, her defense team is adamant that she's innocent. What's their approach?
Their job is to dismantle that narrative that the prosecution is so carefully constructing. They're emphasizing the lack of hard evidence directly linking Monica to the crime itself. And they're going to try to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline, question its accuracy, and argue that it doesn't actually prove that Monica was involved in planning or carrying out the murder.
So it's a battle of narratives then. Whose story will the jury believe, the prosecution's tale of a carefully planned conspiracy or the defense's insistence on Monica's innocence?
That's the million-dollar question in this case, and it's something that'll be explored in depth during the trial. But before we jump into the legal arguments and all the evidence, I think it's important to remember the human element of this story. We've talked about Fabio's success and the shocking nature of his death. But what about Fabio the person? What kind of impact did he have on the people around him?
Yeah, we can't lose sight of that. This isn't just about a crime. It's about real people whose lives have been forever changed by what happened. And Fabio, from everything we've gathered, was more than just a successful businessman. He was loved, he was admired, and he is deeply missed by those who knew him. We've seen accounts from his friends, colleagues, and family, and they all paint a picture of someone who brought joy and energy to every interaction. He wasn't just the life of the party, he genuinely had this warmth and generosity that left a lasting impression on people.
And his story, coming from humble beginnings and achieving so much, it adds another layer of complexity to this already intricate case. It makes you wonder what could have been, what he might have accomplished if his life hadn't been cut short.
It's heartbreaking, and it really underscores the gravity of this whole situation. We're not just talking about legal arguments and pieces of evidence. We're talking about a man's life, a family devastated by loss, and the pursuit of justice in face of this unimaginable tragedy.
And it's also worth noting that the journey to this trial has been incredibly long. Monica's case was delayed for almost 7 years due to various legal complexities. Can you imagine the emotional toll that must have taken on everyone involved? The uncertainty, the constant waiting, not knowing what the future holds.
7 years is an eternity to carry the weight of accusations and suspicion. And during that time, the public's interest, the speculation, it all just intensifies. Opinions become so polarized, with some convinced of Monica's guilt and others believing she's been wrongly accused.
And that public scrutiny, those divided opinions, they're undoubtedly going to play a role in this trial. The jury will have to try to separate fact from fiction, to block out all the noise and focus on the evidence presented in the courtroom.
That's a huge responsibility, and it highlights how crucial the role of a jury is in our justice system. They're the ones who ultimately decide Monica's fate, and that decision will be based on what they see and hear in that courtroom.
Which brings us to a crucial question for you, the listener. What would it take to convince you of Monica's guilt or innocence? As we delve deeper into this case, think about the kind of evidence that would sway your opinion. What specific information would you need to feel confident in your judgment?
That's a great question to consider. This trial is shaping up to be a dramatic showdown. Both sides are ready to fight for what they believe is right. We're going to examine the evidence, analyze all the arguments, and explore the nuances of this case so you can form your own informed opinion.
So stay with us as we continue to peel back the layers of this captivating true crime story. We'll navigate the twists and turns together as we seek justice in this complex case.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Monica Cimienti case. Last time, we set the scene, right? A seemingly perfect life completely shattered by a shocking murder.
Right.
And now we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty, examine the core of this case, the evidence, the arguments that each side is presenting in court.
And what makes this case so fascinating is that it really all comes down to motive and interpretation. The prosecution is trying hard, really hard, to convince this jury that Monica had both the motive and the opportunity to orchestrate Fabio's murder.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. We know they're focusing on her affair with Robert Baker as a primary motive, but is that enough? Would a jury really buy that? People have affairs. It doesn't automatically make them killers.
No, you're right. And if an affair alone wouldn't be enough to get a conviction, they need more, a lot more. And that's where they're relying on all this circumstantial evidence. They're going to try to present this whole series of events and connections that they think point to Monica's involvement.
Like what? Give me some examples. What kind of circumstantial evidence are we talking about here? What might they bring up during the trial?
Well, communication. They'll definitely focus on communication between Monica and Baker. Remember, this was before the trial, so people weren't as cautious about what they said, what they texted. They're looking for anything at all, that suggests they might have been talking about Fabio's routine, the layout of the house, maybe even, wishing that Fabio was out of the picture.
I see what you mean. Those kinds of messages, if they exist, yeah, those could be pretty incriminating, especially if they were sent, like, right before the murder. But couldn't those messages also be interpreted in other ways? Maybe they were just talking about the relationship, not about, harming Fabio.
Exactly. And that's precisely what the defense is going to argue. They'll try to downplay those communications, say they don't actually prove anything concrete about their intentions.
So it's going to be a battle of interpretations. The prosecution will bring up this evidence, and the defense will try to spin it a different way.
Exactly. And it'll be up to the jury to decide which interpretation they think is more believable. The prosecution might also try to create this timeline, to put Baker at the scene of the crime. They could use cell phone records, maybe some witness testimony. If they can prove that Baker was at the house around the time of the murder, and connect Monica to that somehow, that would definitely help their case.
But what if the timeline's not clear? What if they can't definitively place Baker there or connect Monica to it?
Well, then the defense has an opening, right? They can use those inconsistencies, those gaps, to raise doubt. They'll emphasize that there's no solid timeline, that it's all a bit murky.
The defense team, I mean, it sounds like they've got their work cut out for them. They're basically trying to take apart the prosecution's whole story, piece by piece. So besides poking holes in the prosecution's case, what else can they do? How else can they convince the jury that Monica's innocent?
They might try to come up with different theories about what happened to Fabio. They might argue that the original assumption, the knock-knock burglary, that it was actually the right one. Or they could try to point the finger at someone else altogether, someone new.
Now that's interesting. Do they have anyone specific in mind, or is that more of a hypothetical strategy?
We don't know their strategy for sure, but it's definitely a possibility. They might try to bring up some past conflicts Fabio had, enemies, or maybe suggest that someone stood to gain financially from his death.
It sounds like they're trying to plant that seed of doubt, make the jury think, hey, maybe there's another explanation here. It's like a legal puzzle, and each side's trying to arrange the pieces in a way that supports their story.
It's a great analogy, and it's important to keep in mind the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They have to prove, without a doubt, that Monica was involved. The defense doesn't have to prove that she's innocent. They just need to create enough doubt, make the jury question the prosecution's whole case.
And this is where all those legal terms come into play, right? Co-conspirator, circumstantial evidence. It's complicated stuff. Can you break it down for us? Make it easy to understand. I'm sure a lot of people listening aren't familiar with all the legal jargon.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can definitely get confusing. So a co-conspirator is basically someone who agrees with, one or more other people to commit a crime. They don't have to be the one who actually does the crime, but they're involved in the planning, the execution in some way.
Okay, I get it.
And circumstantial evidence, well, that's evidence that you kind of have to read between the lines. It's not direct evidence like an eyewitness or a confession. It's more like evidence that suggests something happened based on all the circumstances,
Yeah.
Like a puzzle piece that fits, but it doesn't give you the whole picture.
So the prosecution is saying that Monica was a co-conspirator, even if she didn't physically harm Fabio. And to do that, they're using a lot of this circumstantial evidence, like communication records, the sequence of events, all that.
Exactly. And the defense is arguing that this evidence, it's not as clear-cut as the prosecution is making it out to be.
This case really shows how complex our legal system is. It's not always easy to prove guilt, especially when it comes to interpretation and deduction.
Absolutely. And it also makes you think about bias. How do our own personal beliefs and experiences affect how we see evidence? Can we ever be completely objective when we're dealing with a case that's so emotional and, well, kind of unclear?
It's a lot to think about, and it's easy to forget that this isn't just a case, it's not just about legal terms and courtroom arguments. There are real people at the heart of this story. Their lives have been deeply affected. We've talked about Fabio, Monica, but what about their daughters? They've been standing by their mother through this whole thing.
I can't even imagine what they must be going through. They lost their father, and now they're watching their mother face these serious accusations.
Yes, sir.
It's just heartbreaking. They're caught in the middle, trying to reconcile the love they have for their mother with everything that's happening.
And their unwavering support for Monica, that's definitely a factor in all this. It adds another layer of complexity.
Oh, absolutely. Their testimony can be very powerful during the trial. They can talk about what kind of person their mother is, how she was acting before the murder, her reaction when it happened. They bring the human element back into all the legal stuff. They remind everyone that this case is about more than just evidence. It's about family, loyalty, and finding the truth after a terrible loss.
It's a reminder that even though this is a huge legal case, with all the media attention, behind it all are real people whose lives have been changed forever. It's not just a courtroom drama. It's a story about how one night, one act of violence can have this ripple effect.
And as the trial goes on, we'll be watching closely. We'll see how both sides present their arguments, how the jury looks at the evidence, and of course what they ultimately decide about Monica's fate.
So, as we head into the last part of our deep dive, let's think about that question we asked earlier. What would convince you? What specific details, what information would make you feel confident in your own judgment about this case?
Right, because in this case, it's not black and white. The lines between guilt and innocence, they're blurred.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Monica Cimienti case. Things are really getting intense now that the trial's in full swing, isn't it?
Oh, definitely.
We've been over the evidence, analyzed all the arguments, and, really tried to understand the human side of this whole story. But now the focus shifts to the courtroom, where, well, the fight for truth and justice is happening right now as we speak.
And what's really gripping everyone's attention is the testimony. Hearing from the people who knew Fabio and Monica, the people who were closest to them, friends, family members, people they work with, even experts. Each person is adding another piece to this puzzle.
But it's not a simple puzzle, is it? I mean, the pieces don't always fit neatly. We've heard conflicting stories, different interpretations, memories being challenged. It's a lot to take in.
That's exactly why cases built on circumstantial evidence are so tricky. It's not like there's this undeniable piece of evidence, this smoking gun.
Hmm.
The prosecution's trying to craft this narrative of guilt based on connections, inferences, and, of course, the motive of the affair with Robert Baker. But the defense, they're fighting back hard, pointing out inconsistencies, offering up other possible explanations.
It's almost like a chess match, isn't it? Each side strategically making moves, trying to sway the jury. Every witness, every piece of evidence, it all has the potential to tip the scales.
And the emotion in that courtroom, it's heavy. Just imagine being there, listening to the details of Fabio's death, seeing the pain in the eyes of his family and friends as they talk about him, and then seeing Monica's daughters sitting right there beside her, so determined, so worried. You can tell this whole thing is weighing heavily on them. It's a scene that would stay with you, for sure.
It's hard not to feel the weight of it all, you know? It makes you realize that this isn't just some legal case, it's a real-life tragedy. Lives have been shattered, families torn apart. It's a stark reminder of the devastating impact violence can have on so many people.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And now, the responsibility of deciding what happened, it rests on the shoulders of those jurors. They've got to make sense of all this information, figure out who to believe, and ultimately decide whether the prosecution's actually proved that Monica is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
It's got to be an incredible amount of pressure, having to decide someone's fate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you got to wonder, right, how do they manage to stay impartial?
Yeah.
How do they push aside their own feelings, their own opinions, and just focus on the facts of the case?
It's the foundation of our justice system, but yeah, it can't be easy. There's always the chance that our own biases, the things we've heard, even media coverage, can affect how we see things, even when we're trying to be objective. This case is a perfect example of that.
For sure. So as we watch this trial unfold, as the jury deliberates, the big question is still there. Will they believe the prosecution's story, the idea of a planned conspiracy? Or will the defense raise enough doubt, enough questions, to get Monica acquitted? It's impossible to say for sure. It really comes down to how those jurors see the evidence, how they interpret what they've heard. We've talked about the challenges of circumstantial evidence, proving motive, all that. But ultimately, it's those 12 people who hold Monica's fate in their hands.
Remember that question we asked at the start. What would convince you? Now that we've gone this deep, I'm really curious, what are your thoughts? What stuck out to you? What would make you feel certain, one way or the other, about Monica's role in what happened to Fabio?
That's the question we all have to wrestle with, right?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer, no piece of evidence that makes everything perfectly clear. And maybe that's one of the most important things to remember from this case, from this deep dive, that truth can be a slippery thing. Justice isn't always simple, and even when things seem clear-cut, there are often shades of gray.
Yeah, there's definitely a feeling of unease that lingers. It reminds us that looks can be deceiving. Even behind the most perfect facade, there can be secrets, darkness. The Monica Cimienti case, it's a cautionary tale. A story about trust betrayed, about the consequences of choices made in secret, and ultimately about our need to understand what happened, to find some sort of resolution in the face of tragedy.
And as we wrap up our deep dive today, I hope it sparked something in you. A desire to keep asking questions, to keep digging deeper, to keep searching for the truth, no matter how complex it might be.
That's what these deep dives are all about. It's about exploring, analyzing, and leaving you with more than just the facts. We want to give you the tools, the knowledge to form your own opinions, and to really understand the world around you. So, until our next deep dive together, stay curious and keep searching for the truth.